All right. So I have the pleasure of talking with you about a very interesting mixed chemical spill we had in Valemount, BC. Um, our program, the Environmental Emergency Branch, actually it is now, responds to all types of incidents that affect land, marine, freshwater. So this one was on a very busy corridor that we'll get to, and it was quite an exciting spill. It was one of my first big responses, and I see a colleague of mine is on this call as well who responded with me. So um, with that, we will get going into it. We're going to look at the incident itself, what the hazardous materials were, and what is a responsible person, which may seem a little bit intuitive to everyone, but it got a little tricky in this one. Some of the response actions, a bit of BC Environment's involvement, some challenges we see with interprovincial carriers as it relates to the Environmental Management Act in BC, how we're improving our response to recovery transition, which is how we get the long-term remediation folks involved, a little bit about BC First Nations involvement, as there are many overlapping territories along this busy corridor, how we close the incident out, and a few lessons learned. So with that, the incident is a little bit about this incident. It occurs kind of in the Rocky Mountain Range. Single vehicle MVI. It was a tractor trailer about 30 kilometers south of Valemount, BC. This stretch of Highway 5 runs along the Alberta River, which is a very sensitive salmon spawning river. Transport truck was carrying a load of mixed hazardous chemicals. Little bit more on that. A lot of chemicals that were not meant to be transported together, were not secured properly. So some intricacies there. The date of it was March 9th at 5 o'clock. We weren't notified until early morning on the 11th. And as we all know from responses like this, a 2-day head start on the or a 2-day delay on the start of response is never a good place to be in. So the MVI was a single vehicle rollover, and it resulted in damage to a BC Hydro transmission line that actually caused a small fire and took out power to 3 very remote residents for about 3 days. BC Hydro couldn't conduct repairs because they couldn't clear the scene of the hazmat response. Incorrect cargo was reported upon the initial call. So it was called in by our BC government Ministry of Transport. And the responsible party had stated it was 45,000 liters of acetone, which was concerning given the fire that had occurred. It turned out not to be acetone, and we'll get into that a little bit. So delays into the reporting and the actual manifest caused a big delay in response to this incident. And as I mentioned, it was right near a wetland that connects to the Alberta River. So a couple images, you can see the tractor trailer upside down. It went over this embankment, took out this power line, and then it had some duct taped on stickers that indicated what we were looking at was not acetone, which caused a little bit of a delay in getting down to the scene as well. So here's an overview of what was on the truck and what was spilled. So diesel, of course, is from the saddle tanks. Luckily, those didn't rupture. We had formic acid, full strength, potassium hydroxide, 600 kilograms, 50% strength. Tetrasodium EDTA, which is a class 8 corrosive, 300 liters of that. So anywhere we see where it's classed instead of a class 27, it was released. The biggest contaminant of concern for us was phosphoric acid. There was a total of 10 1,000 liter totes, and we ended up calculating about 6,500 liters of phosphoric acid, 75% was lost. And that was eating its way through the snow and the topsoil, which we didn't want to get into that wetland. Interestingly, the truck was carrying chemicals from a chemical manufacturing plant to the plant's distribution facility. So the the shipper and the receiver were the same corporate entity, and the truck and carrier were just hired to transport, and that'll become important later on. So, what is a responsible person? We all know how well it's defined. It's the person in care and control. But we do have a little bit of a nuance to our Environmental Management Act where we can hold the product owner liable if we deem necessary. And when you have an uncooperative or unable RP, and you have a massive chemical manufacturing plant that uh, shipped the product incorrectly, that actually opened up a couple of doorways for us to get some response actions underway. So, due to a failure to report and the confirmation that the dangerous goods were of a mixed load and not initially what was reported, two sets of response officers were deployed from Prince George and from Kamloops. This incident occurred sort of in the midpoint of where we divvy up um, our response areas. So myself and a colleague from the southern interior responded. The cargo, as I mentioned, was incorrectly reported. We were able to suit up in our level B and level C suits and go down there to confirm what was lost. Multiple attempts at contacting the responsible party for manifests as well as for information on coverage, insurance coverage, as well as response actions led to the BC government almost taking over this response. We certainly did have to augment, as we would call that one. And within 24 hours of the initial report, we'd had a contractor mobilized to start the hazmat cleanup. So when we look at how BC ENV got involved, we may carry out actions described in Section 91.2, which is responsible persons, if an officer considers that any of these have occurred. And we determined that a spill had occurred, action was necessary to address that spill, and we had reasonable grounds to believe that our action was necessary to safeguard the environment due to a lack of cooperation from the responsible person. And this is leading us into how do we end up with such uncooperative or unable responsible persons? Well, we are seeing a massive increase in transport truck traffic transiting through Highway 5 corridor, whether it's going north or south or all the way west to the Port of Prince Rupert expansion. We just have vastly different environmental regulations. BC has the Environmental Management Act and subsequent spill preparedness, response, and recovery regulations, spill planning regulations, as well as spill reporting regulations. And ICBC is the provincial insurer, whereas Alberta has the Environmental Protection Enhancement Act. They have their own set of reporting regulations and remediation regulations, and that's not to say one is better than the other, just that these carriers are often transiting through with extremely hazardous materials. They have privatized insurance, which might not be as in tune with our response and recovery regulations, as well as the Environmental Management Act as a whole. So we're seeing a lot more missteps right off the bat with some of the carriers that come from Alberta or farther east, just not understanding the provincial regulations they're transiting through. And our previous operating model, this one was an interesting scenario where we had recovery due to the 2017 refresh of the Environmental Management Act. We've had a lot more involvement now from a recovery standpoint, and we get these folks involved earlier on, and they can guide some of the response actions, which in this case was very helpful with understanding water use sources, sensitive wildlife areas, understanding the information that comes from our First Nations, sensitivity area maps. So the recovery section is now often more involved from the beginning of an incident instead of the chemicals off the ground, it's yours now. So that is quite helpful in terms of a response standpoint, understanding how our response actions are going to either make the scenario worse or better years down the road. And the same goes for our Indigenous involvement. These First Nation, so we had a First Nation from the Southern Interior crossed over into their territory, and the spill response actions occurred near a significant fishing area as well as an archaeological area, or an archaeological area of significance for this nation. So this First Nation actually supplied a cultural monitor to monitor all of the site excavations, engage with the response contractor, to assess for potential impacts and to see if what we were doing was causing more harm to an archaeological site than just letting this product naturally degrade. Quite a multifaceted response in this site. Um, at the end of the day, collaborative efforts, we resulted in a successful emergency response and remediation phase, all down to replanting all of the trees that had to be cut out. The site is cleared now, and there was no adverse effects to the river, which was nice to have. And this is sort of where we're talking about these changing landscapes. So it started with increased focus on the Environmental Management Act and the subsequent spill regulations, which enhanced the regulatory framework for the environmental protection caused by spills, and higher standards for spill prevention, reporting, and response, as well as increasing penalties for noncompliance and driving better industry practices. Next, we have the BC government's commitment to reconciliation and with Indigenous communities and nations. So that has led to more collaborative spill response with the nations. They have their own environmental protection folks. They have land managers. They have emergency management um, staff as well. We're integrating more traditional ecological knowledge in response strategies to make sure that what we're doing is not damaging to the potential archaeological sites or sites of significance to the nations, and strengthening partnerships to uphold the environmental stewardship in these territories. And all of this is driven by what we're seeing as an increase in these transport of dangerous goods through these highway corridors. As we see more and more industrial projects come open through BC and on the coast, we're seeing more um, intermodal means of transportation coming through this corridor, higher volumes of hazardous materials, often elevated risk of spills due to the inclement weather. This occurred in March, and we'd had a big icy rain event, and the necessity for updating the training, the equipment, and community preparedness. This happened near the town of Valemount, which is a volunteer fire department that has absolutely no hazardous materials response capacity, um, or the training or equipment to assist. So a lot of these intricacies come into play with all these small towns through the Rocky Mountain corridor. And lessons learned, for us as a branch, the knowledge gaps among the interprovincial trucking companies has become more and more of a sticking point, especially when it comes to privatized insurance that may be outsourced to multinational companies. Many of the operators don't understand the BC spill response and environmental obligations. Regulatory noncompliance leads to these delayed response times and potential penalties, as well as an increased environmental impact. Rising compliance cost. So we're seeing a significant impact when we take over incidents from meeting these requirements, as well as involving more partners and more response needs in these incidents. Additional expenses for engaging First Nations monitors and developing thorough recovery and remediation plans stresses the privatized insurance carriers. We see these pushbacks saying, why do we have to pay for this? We don't have to do this in other provinces. So just a unique challenge of the BC model and how we respond. And challenges with out of province insurance providers. As I mentioned, limited awareness. This particular incident The insurance provider outsourced the spill response actions to a company that's based out of the United States. So it was sort of a privatized insurance outsourced to a call center that outsourced again to another um, response party. So it just prolonged the claim process, provided insufficient coverage for the actual operational need, and it's just a growing pattern of challenges we see as we start seeing more and more dangerous goods transported. Sorry, it was a bit quick trying to whip through that, but I'm happy to take any questions and share some photos if needed.